let's say that I had a little bit of Python experience, but I wanted to become a really great Python developer. So I might sit down with Claude and say, I am very interested in becoming a great Python developer. What topics do I need to learn? Please give me a list. Let's see what it gives us. Okay, so note that I didn't ask it how to get started with Python. I told it that I wanted to become a great Python developer. So as I would expect, it gave us a pretty comprehensive list here. It talked not only about the fundamentals like syntax and data types, control flow, object-oriented programming, but also you can see that it showed us some pretty thorough listing of things like data structures, libraries, debugging, version control, best practices, which I really like to see included here, advanced topics, database integration, and even some DevOps stuff. So this is a really nice list. You could almost think of this as kind of a syllabus that you might use over the course of several weeks or months to expand your programming knowledge. But let's say that I wanted to get started immediately. So I might tell it, let's stick to the fundamentals and see what it gives us. All right, great choice. Mastering the fundamentals creates a solid foundation for everything else. Here's a more focused breakdown of Python fundamentals. So under basic syntax and data types, it breaks things down into variables and assignment, types of numbers, information dealing with strings, booleans, also some type conversion. It gives us some basics of control flow, data structures, functions, modules and packages, file I/O, and error handling. All right, so this is really nice because what it's done for us is in just a second, it's taken us down from this really kind of long laundry list of all kinds of topics that could potentially take years to master to something that you could really kind of figure out in, I don't know, maybe 3 hour or 2 sessions if you have a tiny bit of programming experience, but maybe you've never used it in Python before. So what this gives the learner the opportunity to do is just kind of pick and choose or go through and pick a chunk of this and tell it which topics you'd like to focus on for the current session. And from there, just ask it to create a lesson. So I'm going to ask it to please create a lesson to teach me about Python syntax, structure, and data types. All right, so it's given us some kind of a brief introduction to the Python fundamentals. One of the first things that it points out is that Python's basic syntax relies highly on indentation, which I feel is a great place to start with because that could be really confusing from someone that came from a programming language like Java, where you're used to using curly braces everywhere. Now all of a sudden, indentation is not just there to look pretty and keep your code organized, but your compiler is actually going to use it to try to figure out what you're trying to do. So it gives us, first of all, it tells us about indentation. It shows us comments, both the single line comments and also multi-line comments. It talks a little bit about line continuation. Jumps into modules and imports, a little bit on the early side probably, but that's okay. Doesn't hurt to learn about that. Tells us how we learn about functions using the def keyword, gives us the basic idea of how functions work, shows us data types and what the various numeric types are, and it shows us examples of different ways to define strings, including f strings, which is great. So let's say that we get to this point and maybe I've had some Java programming experience where I'm used to defining types in advance and saying int age equals 25, string name equals whatever. So maybe I'm a little bit confused by the way that numeric types are being defined here. So I might ask it a question like, please clarify how Python knows what type each of my variables are. So notice that I'm assuming that the person who's doing this doesn't have a ton of knowledge about Python. They don't know enough to say, please tell me about Python's dynamic typing system. Maybe they're just kind of new to all this. They don't know what all the terminology is, but they just have questions based on what they're observing in these tutorials, and they want to ask questions the same way that a student might ask questions in class with a live professor. That's really the beauty of this, is that it allows you to say, please clarify how Python does X or Y, and just ask it in conversational language. And let's see if it gives us a good explanation. Oh, perfect. Python uses dynamic typing, which means you don't have to explicitly declare the type of a variable when you create it. The Python interpreter automatically determines the type based on the value you assign. Good job, Claude 3.7. That's a pretty good explanation. So it talks about type assignment at runtime and Python automatically determining the type. Talks about how we can use the type function in order to return the type, dynamic changes, type coercion. So it actually gets pretty far down into the details of how it works in the language. All right, so let's go back to our right pane and continue through this kind of brief tutorial that it created for us about syntax, structure, and data types in Python. So it talks about strings. It shows us how we can use formatted strings, and maybe I've never encountered F strings before. It gives us a little comment that says F strings Python 3.6 plus. That looks kind of intriguing and useful. Maybe I don't want to use the .format command. Maybe I want to use this fstring command that looks like it's possibly based on Python 3.6 and newer. So let's say, please tell me more about fstrings. And it tells us fstrings, or formatted string literals, were introduced in Python 3.6 and provide a concise, readable way to embed expressions inside of string literals. They're now considered the preferred way to format strings in Python. Here's what makes them simple. Talks about the formatting option, talks about rounding to multiple decimal places using the colon decimal to F to specify the number of decimal points that we want. Talks about alignment and padding. Again, it goes a little deep about certain attributes for this point probably in our Python education, but that's okay because we did ask it to give us more information about fstrings, so we can just take as much as we want. All right, I think that's pretty good. Let's go back to our right pane and continue. So it talks about booleans representing truth values. It talks about lists. So let's take a look at lists. Lists are ordered mutable collections. Okay, sounds good. Tuples are ordered immutable collections. So it explains a little bit of the difference between lists and tuples. It tells us that dictionaries can store key value pairs, and it gives us an example of using dictionaries. It gives us an example of sets and says sets are unordered collections of unique elements. So a really common bit of confusion for beginning Python developers is really sort of the difference of when to use lists, sets, and dictionaries, and lists and sets especially. So let's ask for a little bit of clarification here. So let's say sets seem a bit confusing. Why would I use a set over a list? Sets and lists serve different purposes in Python, and choosing between them depends on your needs. Here's why you might choose a set over a list. So it gives us, one, the uniqueness of elements. So sets automatically eliminate duplicates. It sort of points out that we don't want to manually check and filter for a list, which is definitely a error-prone and time-consuming operation. Membership testing is much faster. That's another good feature. And also it gives us mathematical set operations. So those are kind of the big three. So I feel like it's done a pretty good job in explaining the difference between why we might use lists and why we might use sets. All right, let's move on through our example. So type conversion talks about converting to an int or a float. Practical exercise. Try this exercise to apply what you've learned. So it gives us a exercise where it creates a list of dictionaries representing people, adds a person, updates someone, age, prints all people sorted by age. Now let's say that I am really interested in skiing, and I'm not interested in this example with people's names. I want an example about skiing. So I might say to Claude, please create a practice exercise for me that will help me learn about Python data types. Please use skiing as a context. Now let's see what it comes up with. Let's see if it gives us a practice exercise that's something that's more interesting for us. Okay, so it's created a fictitious skiing exercise for us. It's even created, let's see, Python data type skiing exercise, create a list of ski resorts, create a list containing at least 5 resorts, create a dictionary for each ski resort, create a set of skiing equipment. So going to create a set containing unique skiing equipment items, and it has an example of different types of ski runs with different difficulties at each resort. So it's broken our exercise down into a series of tasks. It's given us some nice to-do items, and it's even given us some examples of safety equipment like helmets, wrist guards, and different types of ski passes, and so on, in addition to some of the methods. And it's given us an example solution as well. Plus, over in our left pane, which is generally more for sort of descriptions and plain text representations of answers, whereas the right pane is more for code. In the left pane, it's given us kind of a description of the practice exercise. So I hope that this has been helpful. The point that I'm really trying to make here is just that tools like ChatGPT and Claude are really useful, not just for completing programming tasks for us, but also in helping us become better programmers or learning other skills as well. Hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching.